Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us wherever you are. I'm here to talk to you about modernizing your monoliths with event storming. So, when I talk about what's going on with this, some of the things we're going to talk about, the questions we're going to answer are what do we need to consider going from monolith towards microservices? Now, initially, this talk had a lot of other names that were too long, so we've shortened it. But we're talking about legacy monoliths. We're talking about going towards microservices. So, going maybe to a modular monolith, or maybe all the way to microservices, or maybe how do we take that path there? Event storming is going to help you get there. We're going to talk about what is event storming, what are the types of event storming, how does event storming help with modernization, and how do you get started with event storming today? And then we'll start out first, though, with that whole modernization considerations. So what do we need to consider when we're going from a legacy monolith towards something else? What happens when we need to go from .NET 6 to .NET 8 and then .NET 9? What does it all look like? Well, some of the things we have to think about that we'll have conversations about include things like domain boundaries. So if your monolith isn't broken up into reasonable pieces, you might have this legacy monolith where everything is just kind of collided together and tightly coupled. Your monolith is broken up and you have no idea what to do with it. Event storming will help you to understand those boundaries. The next thing it'll help you understand is your data management. So as you're having conversations about modernizing, you may realize that the way you store data may also need to evolve in the modernization process. Again, don't panic. Keep in mind that as our code is evolving and as we evolve, we also pick up new skills, and then we need to consider these things. So you may have a legacy code base that's relying on a relational database, but it actually, when you're querying it, you find that it makes more sense to go toward like a document database. Or maybe you have relationships that you need to understand, which is going towards a graph database. You have to have conversations to realize how you need to modernize your data storage. Infrastructure is the next one. So when it comes to infrastructure, with modernizing your code, you need to think about that legacy monolith that you're working with. Typically, we're dealing with code, again, everything is all in one model repo. Sometimes that tight coupling is causing problems. So you need to think, are you going to split up an API out of a monolith? Do you need to containerize it? Because everybody gets a container. You get a container, you get a container. Containers are the thing, but this is something we have to think about in our modernization discussions. The last point I'm going to point out is technical debt. Technical debt is a normal topic that should come up in modernization discussions. What code do you have there that isn't getting executed? What features did people put in? Because this would be awesome to have in the future, and the future's here and nobody's using it still. Cut it all out. So these are conversations that we have to have as we're trying to figure out how do we modernize our applications. Now, conversations are key, and that's where event storming is going to come into play. So what is event storming? With event storming, we're going to talk about how this happens. And it goes into the whole, it's a collaborative workshop that is based on a shared understanding with a shared complex business system. The key here is complex. So it's one of those that you look at your code and you're just like, well, I don't really understand necessarily what everything is going on. Event storming will help you to have those conversations about what really is going on in the code, what really is covered in your business side of things, especially, and then how do we translate that into technical. Now, I see that in the conversations that there's questions about monoliths and microservices and distributed monoliths. Think of it this way. Think of you've got your legacy monolith and we're going towards microservices. It's a gray scale in between. There's very different ways to approach it. Okay, so what does event storming look like? This is what I want to show you here. We're going to zoom in a little bit so you can see sticky notes. Lots and lots of sticky notes. So the different sticky notes have different meanings. There's different colors. You'll see we have orange. Orange is events. We'll be talking about these colors here in a minute. The different sizes to also make a difference. The little yellows are going to be the people. But when it comes to event storming, think of it as you get everybody in a room. Now, this picture here is in person. I've done workshops with people in person, but I also do virtual workshops as well on event storming. And so we use something called Miro, miro.com. and again, virtual sticky notes. And so with these sticky notes, we're getting the conversations of what's going on. But before we get too much into the conversations, let's talk about the key people in event storming. What's involved in an event storming situation? First of all, you have the facilitator. The facilitator is the one who keeps things going. They're the ones who are asking the questions when the conversation stalls. That's usually something that's thought provoking. They're the ones who are also watching time. So when it's in a time box situation, they're the ones who have to make sure things are moving at a good point. The other thing with a facilitator that I like to point out is typically you want your facilitator to be outside of the company. And the reason why I say that is a facilitator from outside of the business is not impacted by the office politics. They don't know that this office is not talking to this office or that these policies are in play. They don't have that red tape. They don't have those roadblocks. They can have those conversations. The next set of people involved in event storming are the people with questions, the people who want to know how a system works, the people who want to know what is this feature supposed to do from a business standpoint. Because sometimes as developers and architects, we'll have our own understandings of what we think it should do, but the business expects it to be something totally different. So again, we have to have these discussions to get on the same page, to make sure that we understand the business and we deliver and meet their expectations. Now, the other people who need to be in the room where it happens are the people with the answers. These are your domain experts. These are the people who understand the business side. These may also be the people who understand the technical side. And very, very rarely is that one person representing both business and technical. You really don't want that person. You want to have those separations to get a solid understanding. All right, so it begins. And it starts with one sticky note. And it's an orange sticky note. So orange is the key here. The orange sticky note represents an event. This is the event part of event storming. The facilitator will ask the group how something happened, and everyone has to write their version of the events. So they'll have orange sticky notes all over. And when I do my virtual situation, I actually do this as what is like a private viewing round. So you can see other people putting orange sticky notes there, but you don't necessarily know what they're putting. So you just see fake scribbles instead of actual words. And that's intentional. That allows you to focus on, okay, this is my version of the events. This is my understanding without having to worry, did somebody else put this? Deduplicating that goes into the second round. So we start out, everybody gets all their events out there. The next round, we need to deduplicate. And then the different event storming types take different paths from here. So think of it as there's conversations with sticky notes. The sticky notes both instigate the conversation and they also capture the various pieces of information that we get in those conversations. All right, so what are the types of event storming? Because I mentioned that there's different types and they all kind of scatter from the events at that point. The first one I want to mention is big picture. This one is the one I do the most with companies, and it's because they want to understand something. It's usually what we call a business domain. So understanding more about what's going on in the business, what's going on in this particular business unit, if we're talking in larger companies, what's going on in this particular enterprise resource planning system, and what do we need to know about it? But at big picture, you're getting the most people in the room with the most questions and a lot of subject matter experts, and get a big picture. So generate that shared understanding. The next one is process modeling. So think of it as you're looking at a process. The question of what happened means, okay, what are the steps that you take in that process? So orange sticky notes come, you'll see in an example I have here about e-commerce. So we talk about things like, okay, I need to go search for an item. I need to go purchase the item. And then I need to wait for the item to ship. Oh, hey, cool, I got a notification. Oh, look, there's the delivery right now. Sweet. So you see all these different spots, all these different points, and there are sticky notes for that, each and every one. And those orange sticky notes, again, are written in past tense. So the process modeling, you see the process. You look at the process. It's usually focused on a single end-to-end process because as you realize it, you'll realize that there are more processes. And these are all time boxed. So making sure that you have the ability to stay within the time without going down rabbit holes is key. If there are other processes, you make note of them and have possibly another process modeling situation. But the process modeling, the whole goal is to understand that process And then identify the unknowns in the process and the pain points. The unknowns, so the example I like to use is that we had a situation in e-commerce where one of our systems was not calculating the tax correctly. And we thought it was the ERP system. And the ERP admins are like, I don't know. And then one of our other IT admins is like, oh no, that's the tax system. Let me restart it and everything will work. So we had an unknown of, is it really the ERP system? What part do they need to do? And we had somebody else who's like, hey, wait a minute. So, all right, so that's big picture and process modeling. Now, the next one I want to show is one that I use that's not like something in one of the books. Now, I call it people experience. If you have dealt with me in the community over the years, you know that I am big about the human aspect of computing as well. Don't forget there are humans involved. And so when it comes to people experience, think about looking at a process. So I build this on top of process modeling, and I think about it as how does each step impact your users? How does it impact your customer relationships? How does it impact your developers? So if you're a company who deals with developer tools, for example, you have to think about the developer experience. So you really want to have those conversations to understand that, because those are the ones who are making your money. Okay, system design. So big picture, process modeling, and system design are what's documented. There's official documentation for most of those. There are two books I'm going to recommend toward the end. Big picture and process modeling, well documented. System design, not so much. So system design, EventStorming, is used for building systems, software systems, business systems. Again, with EventStorming, you're having conversations. These sticky notes are there to help encourage the conversation and capture the information that you're gathering. System design, you're wanting to learn more about how the situation is so that you can design a system that meets their problem. You want to hide the unnecessary complexity from the users. If it's unnecessary, why are we doing it in the first place? But try to hide your complexity. And then the last one is refactoring. Now, refactoring is another Sudoku-ism. So basically, I build this on top of system design. And the reason why I call them out as two separate things rather than leaving them as just system design is because I see system design as something that you're dealing with that's greenfield. And realistically, how many of us have the luxury of working with a greenfield system? And that's probably few and far between. We're probably refactoring. So that's why I pull that out, because when you don't have code, it's a whole different mindset. When you have code that exists, now you got to think about, well, what do we have? What does it do? What should it be doing that we don't have it accounted for? So, I see the comments in chat here about the sticky material could be a pain. It's true. And yeah, having the subject matter experts sharing that business process flow to the developers is crucial, because there's so many times where developers will have to, in their brains, they think they have to make assumptions about a process. If you have the conversation, you realize that that process is probably not as convoluted or complex as you really think. It's important to know how the business thinks, how the business translates. I'm not showing any code in today's session, but that's because it's all about the conversations that will get you there to hopefully write less code and get everything cleared. And yes, as Sean is pointing out, it definitely helps with the understanding the misunderstandings and having those kind of evened out. Now, if you have a legacy monolith and that's it, do you really have to do all of those different event stormings? No, you don't have to have a prior event storming session to start tackling refactoring discussions. Now, you're probably wondering, how does event storming help with modernization? So first of all, there's the shared understanding. And with that shared understanding, think of it as everybody is in the room. They're all having these conversations. People are asking questions. People are giving answers. People may be questioning those answers even further. So now you can see how we're starting to get more and more details. Again, going through, okay, well, I didn't understand that properly. We need to go ahead and have this conversation and get a better understanding. The next thing that we have is, when we talk about event storming and modernizing, it's domain-driven design alignment. So if you're in a spot where you're dealing with domain-driven design, which is a whole topic in and of itself, you'll find that event storming will help you to identify how these things work and how to separate things. And I've got a quick demo on that here in a minute. So it'll help with the alignment of that. This is where event storming, I learned about event storming through the DDD community. Identification of bounded context. The bounded context, think of them as boundaries. Within a monolith, you can see your boundaries. It's pretty neat. So we have these conversations where you might think the boundaries are drawn a certain way, but then in your conversations, you get a different understanding. So you redraw the boundaries. When I say boundaries, I'm talking business boundaries, not technology. Again, going back to the business side of things. Another benefit is early detections of bottlenecks and issues, because as you're looking at things, especially with process modeling of it, when you're going through a process and you go like, this is a pain point, I think I know what's going on. You realize that in the conversation rather than in production when a user goes to do something and goes, they can't do this because I don't have access to this. I can't do this because there's a missing button here. Catch it all in conversation before you get it into a production fire. Another thing that it is useful for is accelerated decomposition. So think of it as you're getting a pure representation of the domain, and this goes quickly for you to go, okay, what do we have? What do we need? How do we sort it? And then you start to see the modulars, or you see the services. So modules for modular monoliths, or services for microservices. You get to see that come into play with all the different sticky notes. And then how do you get started with the event storming for modernizing? The last benefit here is your improved communication and collaboration, because you have everybody in the room. Everybody can learn from it. And the best thing about it that I like from a personal standpoint with this communication and collaboration is those silos that you see where we can't talk to each other because we're in different buildings and we're on different teams. By getting into an event storming situation, you're going to build rapport with each other and you'll start to be able to have more conversations. It's fantastic. All right, so how do we get started with that event storming for modernizing an app? It all goes to, it depends. Where do you want to start? So do you understand the business domain? Do you understand the business well enough? If you don't panic. That's what big picture event storming is. Remember, that goal is discovery. Understanding the process within the system is process modeling event storming. How they impact the users, I call that my people experience event storming. Getting into the modules and the modular monoliths or microservices and having those conversations happens in refactoring. And if you're lucky enough to go greenfield, then it's going to be in system design. Now, keep in mind, it starts with one sticky note, and these are the events. This is the event part of event storming. We'll show the storming here in a minute. These are the basic sticky notes that I use in typically all of my event storming situations, and especially event storming for refactoring. So we have the what happened. That is our domain events. We have the who's using that system. These are our users, our roles, and our personas. So they could be something like, oh, this is a admin user versus this is a regular user. Or this could be Saduki, the admin, so it's very specific. These don't have to be general. They can't get specific if you have that in mind. Then what systems are involved? So maybe you have a tax system and an ERP system and a shipping system that you all have to consider. When you're looking at refactoring your code, you want to take a look at any of the pain points or any of the questions that come up. In event storming for legacy apps, especially if you have a legacy app, for example, that you've had for 20 or 30 years in the company, and that person who maintained it is getting ready to retire, you have to have all those questions and all those pain points captured. Do an event storming session with them. That way you can build that shared understanding and learn the little quirks. So one of the questions you might get is, who owns the system? Now, just to point out in the demo here, black sticky notes, I have not seen those in real life, but I use those when I'm doing virtual event storming. Same thing with this here. This is a comment, and this is the Bangers font. I use both of these in Miro. Depending on what group I'm working with, it might be black sticky notes, or it might be just the comments. but they're obviously standing out compared to sticky notes because you want to address those. Yeah, Chris, or they have already retired and now you're like, what did I just inherit? All right, event storming for refactoring. Additional sticky notes that I do sometimes bring in are command and aggregate, but those don't come in until toward the end. A command is typically what triggers the event and is written in an imperative form. So do this, calculate tax, uh, ship order, things like that. When it comes to aggregates, think of them as their larger groupings of business problems. All right, so what does event storming look like? This is an example I use with e-commerce. So you can see all these different sticky notes that are flying in. This is the storm part of event storming. Typically, there are duplicates. I took the duplicates out on this just for the sake of time. But once you have the storm, then you need to start sorting through where are the related events and how do they make sense together. So then once you have those sorted out, then we could start bringing in aggregates. And so we can say, okay, this looks like we have a cart group, a customer group, an order group. And this is just kind of starting here. Now, when you have event storming, so that is just a high level event storming. I talk a bit about it elsewhere as well. And we want to go into the commands, the aggregates. So you saw the aggregates on there, but the commands you would add as well when you're in a spot that makes sense. So if you have to put it on a timeline to understand the process, then you may also need the commands in there to go, okay, I have something that's going to trigger that command. Okay, analyzing event storming results. So once those events are laid out, that's when we start to sort through them and go, okay, how do these group? Does it make sense to put them in what they call an aggregate? And then we have their aggregates, and then we draw their boundaries. So yeah, there is a comment Sean mentioned about if a teammate is colorblind, consider putting the color name on the sticky note if that helps. I like to use iconography. And so I like to put like, there's a shadow figure of just a generic person for my personas. And then I have other icons that I use as well. So that way the colors themselves are hard. Miro does have some support for that as well. And then drawing the boundaries and using bounded context as the guide. Bounded context, again, are boundaries. We're not getting into the DDD side of it as much, but just so you have some examples of the different things that we would see, for example, on an e-commerce side. So it can help you figure out modules or microservices, which way you want to go. But you might see things like products or orders or customers or deliveries, payment processing, and so on. Okay. Now, when it comes to splitting the functionality, you just need to make sure, do the splits make sense? And does everybody are they using the same terms with the ubiquitous language? Are we saying the same thing? Now, event storming, again, I recommend it for modernizing because it has those conversations that you really need to know. So what are you waiting for? This time we have .NET 9 available. Modernize your apps to use .NET 9 and get started with event storming today. Make sure to download .NET 9 at akms.get.net. And then we have some other slides as well. We can make these available later so you can see all the sticky notes and what they mean. And thank you.